start off by saying good morning to everyone and welcome to the Institute for Security Studies. My name is Lauren Tracy Temba. I'm in the Justice and Violence Prevention Program, and we are really happy to have you here today. I'll be chairing today's session, where we'll be asking the big question: is South Africa's anti-corruption system improvement? We have a very full house today, and we've also got an online audience. We'll be broadcasting this seminar live as well. So I'd also like to say welcome to our online audience. The first part of the seminar will be broadcast online, as I've just mentioned, until the end of the formal presentations, at which point we will go offline and open the room up for discussion. And that will be done under Chatham House rules, so please feel free to ask any questions of our great panel up here. We will also then give you an opportunity to have some discussions going and just get into depth with what the presentations have said. I would also like to thank our funders, the Government of Finland. We've got representatives here in the room, and we're fortunate enough to have the Ambassador of Finland join us today as well. We'd like to say thank you to them for funding our anti-corruption work, and to this very important seminar. We'd also like to say thank you to them for funding that. The ISS is also grateful for the support of the members of the ISS Partnership Forum. That is the Hans Seidel Foundation, the European Union, and the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, the USA, whom without these events would not be possible. So corruption is a really complex and politically charged issue in South Africa. And as a result of its complexity, the question of how to hold government accountable for addressing corruption presents a number of challenges. Not only is corruption difficult to quantify, but it's also difficult to assess the success of the efforts that are being made by government agencies that are intended to tackle corruption. Today's seminar will assess the nature of the country's recent experiences of state capture and provide particular profile to the role of the key developments of the Special Investigating Unit, which plays a crucial part in the South African multi-agency anti-corruption system. This seminar will also aim to profile some of the products available on the new ISS anti-corruption portal, which is a tool for civil society and other stakeholders to improve public knowledge on the nature of corruption and developments in the South African state's efforts to tackle it. But it does this by providing easy-to-read articles, reports, and infographics that you're able to access. So as not to take up much more time, and before I introduce our great panel, I'd like to hand over to the Ambassador of Finland, Ambassador Kari Alanko, for some opening remarks. If you could please join me in welcoming him.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. It's a pleasure and honor to have been invited to address you today on what is surely one of the most complex and topical issues to discuss in South Africa, corruption. Let me start by saying how happy I am that the Embassy of Finland has been able to support the excellent work of the ISS. Today we are here to discuss the functioning of the anti-corruption system in South Africa, as well as to launch the ISS anti-corruption portal, which can be accessed through the ISS Crime and Justice Information and Analysis Hub. Corruption distorts economic growth and threatens democracy, the rule of law and human rights. Lack of sufficient control on corruption is also contributing to the crisis in democracy around the world. It is a concern for individuals, societies, the private sector and international organizations. Government agencies have a leading role in fighting corruption, but civil society and media have a crucial role in holding political decision makers and governments accountable and promote more transparency. The latest corruption barometer in Africa, which was conducted between September 2016 and September 2018, shows that majority of citizens surveyed in 35 African countries think that corruption is getting worse and their governments are doing a poor job in fighting it. In South Africa, 64% of people think in that barometer that corruption increased in the last 12 months before the survey. The average for all countries was 55%. The survey also highlights that corruption disproportionately affects the poorest citizens, who have to pay bribes twice as often as the richest to access public services such as healthcare and police assistance. Young people pay more bribes than their elders. Anti-corruption work is important for Finland both domestically and in our international cooperation. You may have heard that Finland has been ranked as the happiest country in the world for the last couple of years, and one of the reasons is the low level of corruption in Finland. Finland is consistently ranked among the least corrupt countries in the world in the annual Corruption Perception Index, and in 2019 was ranked third, so we are not doing enough. Finland is also the most stable country, the most free, and has the best governance in accordance with some annual international comparisons. Finland's development from a poor rural country to a developed nation with a highly competitive economy and good quality of life has been based on heavy emphasis on the people and high-quality education for all citizens. At the heart of Finland's development has also been the society-wide trust between public sector, civil society, private sector and academia. Finland is not, however, immune to corruption, and studies show that instead of street-level corruption, larger-scale structural corruption that is more difficult to detect does extend to an extent. Such corruption often occurs in the interface between the public and private sectors. We are aware that corruption prevention and combating requires constant work and extensive cooperation domestically and internationally. Coming back to today's discussion, the functioning of the South African anti-corruption system and the launch of the anti-corruption portal, I see this work as an important contribution to the work towards stronger national systems and reducing corruption and its effects in South Africa. The more reliable information there is available for government as well as for the public, the easier it is to make the right decisions on corruption and tackle it. Strengthening public awareness and intolerance to corruption, as well as strengthening the integrity of the public administration and the transparency in its work, are crucial tools in anti-corruption work. Finally, I'd like to congratulate ISS in taking this initiative and hope that the anti-corruption portal will be used by civil society and a wide range of stakeholders as a tool to improve knowledge on corruption and how the government is responding to it. I wish you all fruitful deliberations and success in the anti-corruption work you are engaged in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Carey. I think, I have to echo what Ambassador Carey has said, particularly with regards to government agencies having to play a leading role in addressing corruption. But so too does civil society. They have a unique role to play in holding government accountable and ensuring transparency where issues of corruption are concerned. Now I'd like to move on to my panel, and I think our first speaker needs little introduction. He was appointed by the President of South Africa as effect from May 2016 and tasked with leading the SIU to execute its mandate to investigate maladministration, malpractice, and corruption within state institutions as authorized by proclamations issued by the President of South Africa. The ultimate goal of which is to recover money and assets that have been lost as a result of state institutions and referred perpetrators for prosecutions for disciplinary action. To realize this mandate, he introduced a turnaround strategy that internally puts premium on improved performance, effective leadership, clean governance, and building strategic partnerships. His professional journey prior to 2016 extends to one of his earliest jobs as a public prosecutor and then magistrate in the Johannesburg and Soweto Magistrates Courts. In 2012, he was appointed as the Standard Bank Head of Operations Risk and then as Executive Director at MedScheme Holdings in 2013, all of which have culminated into the outstanding qualities and values that he portrays in his current position. I'm pleased to present our keynote speaker, the head of the Special Investigating Unit, Advocate Andy Mothibi. Our second speaker, very eager, our second speaker is Mr. David Bruce, a writer and researcher specializing in the field of policing, criminal justice, public security, corruption, violence, and crime in South Africa. Since 2011, David has worked as an independent researcher, primarily on contract for organizations in the South African NGO sector. His work includes a number of reports on corruption and investigative systems to address it. He has a master's degree from the University of Witwatersrand and is a visiting research fellow at the School of Governance at the University of Witwatersrand. And then lastly, we have our very own head of the Justice and Violence Prevention Program here at the ISS, Mr. Gareth Newham, who joined the ISS in January 2010. Prior to joining the ISS, Gareth worked as the Strategy and Policy Advisor in the Gauteng Provincial Ministry of Community Safety from 2006. Before joining government, he worked in the Criminal Justice Program at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation for 7 years. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Advocate Mothibi, to shed some light into how corruption has become entrenched not only in South Africa, but the role that multi-agency anti-corruption systems like the SIU are playing in tackling corruption in South Africa. Please help me welcome Advocate Mothibi.
Oh, it's on. Is it on here already? Okay. Okay. All right. Good morning, colleagues and all who are here present. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and participate in this conversation, which we regard as very important in terms of sharing our contribution into the fight against this scourge of corruption. I've prepared a presentation which, because of the time frame, I will not cover all of the slides. Some of them you would probably be familiar with the contents in terms of the definition of corruption and what is fraud and so on. We will then go into the conversation around, the role of SIU and the multi-agency approach that our country has adopted. Right, as I say, I'll probably focus on corruption trends and the strategic approach to corruption prevention. The first part is really interesting, though, but I think everyone would probably be familiar with what really constitutes corruption. But just briefly to flip through, we work as defined by various legislations, but for corruption specifically, there's a legislation called Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. So this is the basis where we say we are investigating corruption. It has to be relayed back to the provisions of this legislation so that we are able to say we've got sufficient evidence that would constitute corruption. The definitions, we come across various natures of corruption, which in the main is misrepresentation, wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. There's a whole lot of dishonest activities that we find in the system. The subcategories, there are those that we also find in the process. There's a whole lot of asset misappropriation in the state institutions. Embezzlement, we come across that on a day-to-day basis. Fraud is one of the big problems that we find, which also has an element of misrepresentation, but it also leads to the corrupt activities. Money laundering, I've just come now from a session where an organization called FATF is evaluating South Africa, which is the Financial Action Task Force. I've got my colleague here, the director of FIC, Financial Intelligence Center, who really is coordinating that session. So money laundering is something that we also look at to make sure that we see the flow of funds so that we are ultimately possible to pinpoint what are these proceeds of crime being used for. Bribery, facilitation fees, so-called kickbacks, we've seen those in many instances, and nepotism. Referring briefly, when we do our work, we also look at what the plan of the country says. The National Development Plan, in terms of this plan with South Africa, which is a 2030 vision, we would like a situation where even now there should be zero tolerance, but this plan says by 2030, South Africa should be the one that has zero tolerance for corruption and all other related consequence management. I'm not going to go into detail with that, but of importance is that we need to really build a resilient anti-corruption system that will respond to the question that we are raising today. Is this system improving? Is this system becoming resilient as we would like it to be? Strengthen accountability and responsibility of public servants, holding public servants accountable. Create a transparent, responsive, accountable public service, strengthening of the judicial governance and the rule of law. Again, this is still part of the National Development Plan. It's really just saying, as we develop strategies of fighting this scourge of corruption, we must make sure that we also meet the plan as crafted by the country. There's some of the indicators that we come across, and we just thought we'll probably just share with you. And I think of importance is that there's a whole number of dishonest actions, lying relating to the mistakes, and also fraudulent reporting or abuse of company policies and assets, abuse of privileges, perjury, and some of in the gambling institutions we see that. And then we also, as we investigate, we make sure that we recommend some of the controls that the state institutions should put in place. What are the controls and what is the culture? Is the whistleblowing process effective? Policies relating to also code of conduct and awareness training, and the screening is very important. You would have read recently that some of the employees in a state institution are refusing to be screened, are refusing to be vetted. So that is a problem for us. We would like to make sure that we have what we can tick as integrity of those, especially those who are involved in the supply chain management process. Now, in terms of corruption trends, we just really wanted to show that we look at some of these trends. We've looked at the risk assessments. This is the one that was conducted by the Institute of Risk Management. You can see that fraud is up there, corruption is also up there, the leadership issues are being pointed out. So the big block there on the right-hand side indicates that the biggest part of our percentage of investigations is procurement. And understandably, that's where really the money gets stolen by giving out irregular contracts and by giving out irregular tenders. So we thought we'd highlight that. And in terms of the country risk profile, we just made a few points. Unemployment plays a big role. Growing income disparity. We are informed that the disparities are even more pronounced now, even before 1994. So these are some of the factors that we need to take into account. Failure of governance. This is something that we have picked up in most of our investigations in the state-owned entities, even in public departments. Fraud and corruption, inadequate or substandard education and skills. Those are some of the things that we've come across. Now, we also continuously look at what other international trends are. You would probably know that Transparency International, which Corruption Watch is really part of, if I'm not mistaken. David Lewis is here. We continuously make sure that we engage with them, and I'll come back to some of the activities that we are doing. If you look at 2017 and compare it to 2018, you will see that there's really not a movement from a scoring perspective, and the ranking part is also something that we need to look at. So what we have said is that we would like to make sure that we understand the drivers behind the scoring, so that we position the country such that we are able to improve on this ranking. These rankings are important because the investors look at that, and some of the stakeholders look at it. And the more that we do not improve, it really poses a risk. The work is underway. We've got what we call anti-corruption task team, which coordinates most of the law enforcement agencies, and I'll touch briefly on that later on. The cost of corruption, I think the ambassador mentioned some of those here. I will not go into detail with all of them, but as you know, corruption, as we have determined, increases government spending and reduces government revenue. This impacts on the service delivery, and the large budget deficit that we continuously told of. It really gets impacted by the levels of corruption that we have seen. All of those bubbles, they are really indicating some of the aspects where corruption plays a role. As you can see there, the indirect economic costs, inefficient public investment, reduced private and foreign direct investment, reduced entrepreneurial innovation, and some of the other impacts. It's important that we take this into account so that as we fight this scourge, we are able to see the improvement that we want to see. The corruption levels, and David Lewis, you'll relate to this. We have borrowed from some of the work that has been done by Corruption Watch. Is a very important stakeholder. So some of the reports that Corruption Watch receives, and you'll hear later on that we have formed a platform where we work together with the civil organizations, so that we give meaning to this societal approach to fighting corruption. So all of those reports are taken into account. Due to time, I will not go into details with that. We've also looked at some of the situational analysis in terms of the corruption reports per location. As you can see there, national government contributes or the biggest percentage, and by national government we're including national departments, SOEs, and some of the entities that we look at. We also look at, on your right-hand side, we also look at some of the reports that the Auditor General releases. I think he was in Parliament yesterday or day before, where it continues to be a worrying discovery by the Auditor General, irregular expenditure in the state institutions, and we are aware that irregular expenditure does not always translate into corruption. But this is a risk indicator. So when we get those reports, we go through them, and make sure that we analyze where there could be an indication of the need to investigate. Right, I would like to now start off with the real role of SIU. SIU is a state entity that is legislated in terms of the Special Investigating Unit and Special Tribunals Act. This entity was created as part of the multi-agency approach. All of the agencies which I'll talk to later on, our vision is that we would like to be the preferred and trusted forensic investigation and litigation agency. The ultimate objective of recovering, and I'm going to talk to that again later on. We've got various powers that we use to investigate, all of the powers that are given to investigative agencies. The major functions really is to investigate corruption, malpractice and maladministration, and to institute civil proceedings. We are the agency that is empowered by our legislation to institute civil litigation to recover monies. We've got in the middle is those powers that we use, the search and seizure and all of that. And then out of our mandate, we work closely with the police, NPA, for prosecution. If anybody needs to be arrested, we then enlist the services of the police. We have just gone through a rigorous reorganization. But when we did that reorganization, we asked ourselves various questions. And this is where I would like to spend a few minutes. So the first question is, are we at risk to remain relevant? And that is answered also by the next question in terms of whether are we making the impact that's required by the public or by everyone who is looking at this entity. So in order to remain relevant, we have to make sure that we make the impact that matter. So the impact that matter, and you'll see later on in terms of our outcomes of investigation. We want to make sure that we are measuring up on performance against the global scale, doing the basics right. A trusted team player, fostering a cohesive multi-agency approach. As I indicated that the country has adopted a multi-agency approach. We want to deliver quality professional service cost effectively, and we continuously ask ourselves, what is the public and media perception about SIU? Are we dealing with the investigations? Are we producing quality investigations and quality outcomes? An employer of choice to those who would like to come in and contribute. We want to be top of mind and first port of call across all spheres of government. When we did this reorganization, it was informed by the new strategy that says we need to make sure that we know the drivers of making impact. This strategy resulted in some reorganization, which resulted into the new value chain, into the new structure. And when we did this, we also make sure that we improve the internal governance. And we are committed to clean governance. Third year in the row, this year we received a clean audit. And as part of doing that, we are uncovering internal irregularities which affect some of the colleagues, and we make sure that we take action against those who needs to be acted upon. The next slide really this is where we would like to believe that South Africa is making great progress in improving anti-corruption legislation and enforcement. And I'll talk to that when I talk to the outcomes that we reach as SIU. This is the legislative framework. I won't go into detail with the legislative framework that we work around. There's various action, the Constitution of South Africa, Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. There's a most important financial legislations that we look at, which is the Public Finance Management Act and also the Prevention of Organized Crime. Now, the approach that government has taken over and above the multi-agency approach, it's the societal approach, and there's various levels. We have just put that slide there. It looks a little bit busy, but this slide really just says we need to look at a societal approach where we know what are the drivers of making sure that we include even civil society in the fight against corruption. At the top is the Constitution that guides us, and we have to make sure that we know what are the enabling drivers. So at the bottom there, you will see that we've got all of those agencies that are involved in the ACTT space, right? There's a multi-agency approach, and all of this that we are doing is that all those agencies in the ACTT, we have to make sure that we do risk and threat assessment, prevention, detection, investigation, and at the end, we would like to see people prosecuted. We would like to see the recoveries from the system. The next slide really just says we as a country, we are busy finalizing the consolidation of the national anti-corruption strategy. This process has taken a wide range of consultation and is one of those areas where we are saying we need to also continue to make sure that the country works together, including the civil society. There at the top left, we say we need an ethical and accountable state, business and civil society sectors in which those positions of power and authority act with integrity. Citizens who respect the rule of law and are empowered to hold those in power to account. Zero tolerance of corruption in any sphere or activity, and substantially reduced level of corruption. But in the main, this is the strategy that will guide us. We have since recently set up what we call a reference group, and that reference group includes business, it includes civil society, includes government. That group is going to facilitate towards the finalization of this strategy. And we are really glad to see that progressing. We are aiming to finalize that strategy probably by early next year. This slide, there it just talks to the consequence management now, right? We are saying criminal prosecution and disciplinary action has to result in all of those who make themselves guilty of corruption. I won't go through line by line, but as you can see, that investigations to be followed up with appropriate criminal or disciplinary action. This is where, and we have seen a correlation. We have seen a correlation between failure to take action and the increase of the incidence of corruption. If we do not hold people accountable, if we don't prosecute those who make themselves guilty of corruption, the correlation consequence is that there's that complacency, there's impunity, and people continue to commit these acts with the knowledge that there will be no action. So that's the part that we have really made sure that it's getting improvement. With the new leadership at NPA, we have made sure that we revise all of those cases that we have sent, and we are seeing traction in some of those. Some of those investigations we are doing in some of the state-owned entities, we are going to see action very soon. I'm glad to put that over. The next slide really talks to the prevention approach that we have adopted. What we call vulnerable sectors, corruption vulnerable sectors. This is part of the program that is run by this multi-agency approach. Right? The multi-agency includes SIU, Financial Intelligence Center, NPA, the Hawks, which is the DPCI, the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, SARS, and other entities. So this risk assessment of vulnerable sectors has led us to the following. This is what we have identified as some of those sectors that we need to start focusing at. Honestly, every sector is very critical here. It's very important, but we had to create a blueprint of where we start to make sure that we can roll it out into other sectors. We have started with the health sector. At the health sector, we have created the Health Sector Anti-Corruption Forum, which includes Corruption Watch, Section 27, members of government, and other members of the public, just to make sure that this societal approach in fighting corruption we give pronunciation to. The next sector, construction, and we are going to also go into the state-owned entities. But we have been urged now, because of some of the reports we receive, that we need to prioritize number 5, which is local government. We are going to roll out the blueprint that we have seen on the health side into the local government. Some of the slides that are following is really some of the critical factors we have considered in prioritizing these areas. We have looked at some of the case studies, nature of business, magnitude of the transactions that are involved in the sector, exposure to corruption, the nature of government spending. And as I said, we've now looked at the health sector. We also looked at some of the vulnerabilities in the health sector. Again, I won't go into detail with that because of time. But we have seen traction in this space. The biggest take out of this for now is that there's where the government is bleeding in the medico-legal space, where we have seen that lawyers, doctors, and some of the intermediaries are making themselves guilty of corruption and maladministration, and we are busy with the investigation in that space. The major contributing factors that we have picked up: collusion, lack of effective consequence management, weak processes and systems, conflict of interest, and some of the strategic interventions are as follows. We have conducted the risk assessment, and we have done profiling and vetting of professionals. We have blacklisted some of the entities in the health sector. We've conducted financial intelligence analysis on doctors and state attorneys. We've monitored the media coverage on corruption in the health sector. So this sector is now receiving a consolidated approach and integrated approach. We have now also just looked at some of the vulnerabilities, which are the contributing factors. Again, it's almost like a repeat of the previous slide, but we have said, amongst others, we need a proactive intervention in this space, where we stress collaboration, capacity development, reporting and referral, and risk management and prevention. So those bubbles are showing the focus areas. Again, we are stressing that over and above the reactive approach, we need to make sure that we take the proactive approach, which is, and I'll come back to that, which is the data analytics and the other approach. This still talks about the combating or proactively combating corruption. We would like to make sure that at the end we create the framework where state institutions can use to assess high risk and vulnerable industry sectors. On the bottom there, we're saying by implementing a multi-stakeholder collaboration approach. This is still work in progress, but we have already seen some of the traction. This should lead us into development of the Digital Corruption Prevention Index. This is the index that the public will know, and we will be able to indicate whether we are making traction in terms of ensuring that the corruption prevention takes place. This next slide really just says we are going to create a capability of data analytics. This data analytics has to result in the heading, risk scenarios. These risk scenarios should tell government that these are your corruption risk exposures. These exposures, either it's in the state-owned entities or in health or in the government departments, we need to make sure that they understand that and what are the controls that they put in place, and in their planning process, what is it that they need to look at. We'll have the data on the left-hand side, and we are building a risk engine which will model this data. And once it's modeled, the output that we require is the exposure. We need to understand the exposure that government faces. And as a result of that, at the bottom there, we would like to see an improvement in the control environment of state entities. The next slide really just touches on those priority industry sectors that I spoke of earlier on. The Corruption Vulnerability Index is something I've spoken about that. As you can see, those would be some of the parameters that we use, and this index should be on an ongoing basis be published so that the public could know how is it that we are doing in that space. On the investigation side, I really just want to focus on the outcomes, and I'm almost at the end. These are the main outcomes that we reach when we investigate, right? The first one on the left-hand side is civil litigation. Civil litigation, we've got on our books now, the civil litigation matters that are quantified. You've probably had this figure being bandied out there, 14.7 billion worth of the value of matters that are on our civil litigation book. There's also others, and we've got a new development in that space, which I'll talk to you later on. We would like to make sure that disciplinary action referrals are also actioned on. What we have referred to state institutions to act on the disciplinary referrals, we would like to make sure that we follow up, and that talks to the impact that I referred to earlier on. Prosecutions and referral to other regulatory authorities. In the investigation, we pick up a whole lot of, for example, tax-related infractions, and those we send to the South African Revenue Service. We work very closely with the Financial Intelligence Center. We've got MOUs with all those institutions to make sure that we produce the results that we look for. Those are really the main outcomes that we reach. I thought this is in our annual report. But as you can see, on the top left, this is some of the figures that we have managed to reach. As we investigate, we found that there's irregularities either in the tendering process, on the contracting process, and when we find those irregularities, we are not shy to tell the state institution to cancel the contract so that we can follow the civil litigation process. As an example, about 7.9 billion worth of the values of the contracts that we have indicated to state institutions that they should save. 999 million, that refers to matters of contracts where we have set aside as a result of being either being awarded on a fraudulent basis, irregularly, and the 137 million is the what you could call cash that we have recovered from some of those individuals and companies, by the way, the private companies that do business with government. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go through all of the headlines. You can read them in our annual report, but I want to focus on the point that is at the bottom. The special tribunal is established. I'm going to come back to that one very soon. The next slide, really, I've already spoken about the health sector anti-corruption forum. I think the information is sufficient. This is one of the innovative ways that we are tackling the sectors in terms of making sure that that we investigate appropriately. You will see we are already there's few proclamations that the president has signed off in terms of strengthening the fight against corruption in this space. Council for Medical Scheme, bottom left, Board of Healthcare Funders, and in the National Department of Health, we also work closely with FIC. So we want to make sure that that sector is really used as a blueprint. I mean, this presentation, you can probably look at it at a later stage. But as I said, this health sector anti-corruption forum is a very important sector that we want to use as an example. These are some of the investigations that we are conducting. The top left one is the recent proclamation, which was issued now in October. This is the organization and the entity that deals with health products. The next one is the one that we have investigated in the Department of Health in Gauteng, the Council for Medical Schemes, which is the regulator, the Health Professions Council, and the National Health Laboratories. So this is an indication that we would like to see an improvement in the fight against corruption. This is still on the health sector. I said I want to speak to you about the special tribunal. The special tribunal is a tribunal that has been set up by proclamation by the president. This is almost what you could call a special court, if you like. It started being officially functional now in October. It's going to be sitting in Gauteng South, in the Joburg South. This tribunal already, all of those cases that I said are on our books. Some of them will be transferred to this tribunal so that we can speed up the recovery of the civil matters. I've already seen an indication that the time is up. These are really just the closing remarks to say, really, as a country, as entities, as everyone, we need to make sure that we focus on the improvement in the governance framework, strengthening the action to improve prevention and detection, ensuring that corruption is systematically and appropriately sanctioned. I did say the correlation between failure to take action and the increase in the incidents. Prosecution, regulation, and reinforcement of the regulation, strengthening of anti-corruption efforts. The leadership, cannot stress this enough, that leadership is key to making sure that we are capacitated to fighting corruption. The question around adequate funding, I think you may have heard that before, central oversight, and the societal factors that we take into account. The last slide is about the whistleblowing. The whistleblowing that goes hand in hand with the witness protection. We have made sure that as everyone who blows the whistle, we make sure that they are protected appropriately. And we've got the program of ensuring that the witnesses are protected. I'd like to thank you very much. I've given you an overview of what the role of SIU is and how is it that we are striving to improving this anti-corruption framework and anti-corruption efforts. And I believe that we are on a good trajectory as long as we are able to demonstrate effective investigation, quality outcomes, and guess what? Consequence management, whether it's civil, criminal, or disciplinary, and the regulatory environment to making sure that the public can see that there's action being produced out of our efforts. Thank you very much. I would like to end here and thank you for the opportunity. Thanks.
Right, I'd like to thank Advocate Matibi for what was very an eye-opening presentation, particularly on the intricate role played by the SIU in its fight against corruption. I think we're all in the room well aware of the economic impact that corruption is having on the country, but also the socio-economic impact that corruption is having on the country. So when you hear that employees are still refusing to be screened and vetted, I think that's a concern that we should all have. And I think it also emphasizes the need to build a resilient anti-corruption system, one that holds individuals accountable and ensures transparency. So with that, now that we know about the role of the Special Investigating Unit, what do we need to do about strengthening the agency, David? I believe your presentation will focus on ways in which we can strengthen the role of the SIU. Let's see. Please help me welcome David Bruce.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to greet you and thank the ISS for inviting me to speak here this morning. What I'm going to be speaking about is I'm just going to be doing a brief presentation, which is essentially speaking to one of the publications which is being released today as part of the ISS's anti-corruption portal. So you'll see that there's leaflets or notice here which announces the publication of a number of different publications today by the ISS. And what I'm going to be doing right now is just speaking to one of the publications, which is one of two that I've written, which is focuses on the SIU. And so just Advocate Matibi has already presented you with an overview of the SIU, the role that it plays, and some of the issues and challenges that it is confronting. The report that I have written, which is published today, is intended to provide an overview of the Special Investigating Unit. In writing the report, I was motivated principally by the perception that it is important for us to understand more about the SIU. The SIU is an important component of South Africa's anti-corruption machinery, but it seems to me that debates and controversies about mechanisms for addressing corruption in South Africa tended to overlook the SIU. For some time, the investigating agencies that have been the focus of attention have been the Scorpions, its successor the Hawks, the Public Protector, and most recently the NPA Investigating Directorate. Perhaps the SIU is better off if it remains uncontroversial. However, considering that our resources for dealing with corruption are not infinite, we need to ensure that we are getting the most out of the investments that government is making in addressing corruption. I therefore wanted to understand more clearly where the SIU fits into our anti-corruption efforts. Also, are there steps that should be taken to strengthen the SIU in order to enable it to play a more effective role in addressing corruption? The report is available for you to read. After discussing the history of the SIU, its mandate and powers, and skills and resources, the report focuses on three key interrelated issues about the SIU: its independence, its investigations, and its impact. Based on this analysis, the report makes 6 substantive recommendations about how to strengthen the SIU and its impact. In the time available, I am not going to attempt to provide a detailed synopsis of the report. Instead, I will be focusing on 2 of the issues that are some of the issues worthy of consideration in relation to the SIU. One of these issues is the independence of the SIU. Prior to the establishment of the NPA Investigating Directorate in March 2019, the SIU was South Africa's only dedicated anti-corruption agency. The legislation which provides for the establishment of the SIU is clearly a product of another era in the politics of democratic South Africa. At the time when the legislation was initially passed in 1996, it seems that it was unproblematic to create anti-corruption agencies which were designed to operate at presidential behest. On its website, the SIU describes itself as an independent agency, but this should primarily be understood to mean that it is not part of any other agency. I'm not trying to suggest that the SIU has operated to carry out presidential vendettas or in a manner that is non-partisan. Nevertheless, relative to the standards that have been identified by the Constitutional Court as preconditions for an organization's independence, the SIU falls short in many ways. There is a quote that I often reflect about and refer to that can be found in the government's anti-corruption strategy diagnostic report. This states that, apart from the technical skills required, anti-corruption agencies tend to stand and fall on the basis of their perceived fairness and independence in the eyes of a broad coalition of support across sectors. As we know from experience in South Africa, over the last 15 years, many of those who are the subject of investigation for alleged corruption will seek to discredit the agencies involved in investigating them. In so doing, they undermine the credibility of anti-corruption agencies and the legitimacy of efforts to address corruption. Insofar as it is possible for our anti-corruption mechanisms to demonstrate that they are objective and politically non-partisan, this may assist in neutralizing attempts to discredit them. If the SIU is recognized as an important part of South Africa's anti-corruption machinery, then strengthening the independence of the SIU is critically important if we are to create trust and confidence in our anti-corruption mechanisms. The second issue that I'm going to focus on is that of SIU referrals. The SIU is an anti-corruption agency, but it is not a criminal justice agency. What the SIU does is carry out investigations and institute civil recovery processes for the purpose of recovering state money from those who are alleged to have acquired it illegitimately. Civil recovery processes in the courts can themselves be very slow, and for some years the SIU has been hampered by this fact. However, the re-establishment of the special tribunal, which has just been alluded to by Advocate Matibi, should hopefully dramatically expand the effectiveness of the SIU by expediting resolution of civil recovery processes initiated by the unit. There is little doubt that there is great value in the role that the SIU performs. Nevertheless, there are significant limitations to what it does. One of these is that those who have been involved in irregular use of state funds are likely to remain in government employment unless the government departments for which they work take disciplinary steps against them. In this respect, the SIU has significant limitations. It can refer the evidence that it has uncovered to the relevant government department and recommend that disciplinary steps be taken. But it cannot ensure that these disciplinary processes do in fact take place and that they are implemented in an efficient and professional manner. It also cannot ensure that the government departments to which the recommendations have been made report back to it on the outcome of the disciplinary steps that have been taken. Likewise, it can refer the evidence that it has to the NPA, but it cannot compel the NPA to ensure that this evidence is properly evaluated, that, if necessary, further investigation is conducted, and that in appropriate cases steps are taken to turn this evidence into prosecutions. On the one hand, the report being released today highlights issues to do with how the government system operates. Government investment in the SIU is part of a broad investment in addressing corruption. But the SIU is only able to report on its own civil recovery processes. It has not been able to provide answers to questions about the eventual outcome of cases that it refers to others. That the SIU is unable to account for the criminal and disciplinary outcomes of its investigations is part of an outdated system in terms of which government departments report on their own performance only, as measured by performance indicators that reflect outputs that fall within their own span of control. As a result, there is frequently no clear information on processes that require the involvement of more than one department. This does not support the public interest in fully understanding the outcome of the investment that government is making in addressing corruption. As alluded to by Advocate Matibi, the SIU has taken steps to resolve these matters. In 2018, government introduced a system for ensuring that SIU reports are released to the affected state institutions, and for state institutions to provide feedback regarding steps that they have taken to implement the SIU's recommendations. The SIU has also signed a memorandum of understanding with the NPA to track the progress of the SIU's criminal referrals, and reported today that they are seeing results with this. Hopefully these will bear fruit, and the SIU will in future be able to provide more detailed information about the outcome of both disciplinary referrals and referrals to the NPA, and perhaps some of the other referrals that Advocate Matibi alluded to. Ultimately, therefore, it appears clear that by virtue of its civil recovery role, the SIU plays an important role in South African society. At the same time, it raises questions about how we give effect to the rule of law in South Africa. In a certain sense, the SIU may be seen to contribute to realizing the rule of law, in that people are prevented from benefiting from resources that they have acquired illegitimately. At the same time, we should also expect that more of those who do so are held more fully accountable, both through disciplinary processes in the government departments for which they work, and through prosecutions by the NPA. In terms of rule of law principles, where there is substantive evidence to this effect, those who are alleged to be involved in serious crimes should be prosecuted. The SIU therefore needs to be more independent. At the same time, rather than being seen as a standalone agency, it needs to work in a manner that is complementary to and is complemented by other agencies. And that's all from me, so thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for that very thought-provoking analysis on the SIU and highlighting some of the limitations that face the agency, for example, in ensuring that disciplinary steps are taken where referrals are given. And also obviously highlighting again the important need to strengthen the independence of the organization and establish it almost as a single and stable entity. Right, rounding up our presentations, we now move on to Gareth Newham, who will in some way try to answer the very question of this seminar, which is South Africa's anti-corruption system improving? Gareth?
Thank you very much, Lauren. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see you all here today, and thank you for coming to the seminar, and particularly to the Finnish Embassy and our ambassador. The support you give to our anti-corruption work is very much appreciated. So, is our anti-corruption system improving or not? Certainly one component of it, the Special Investigation Unit, seems to be and is well on its way. I will speak a little bit about what the system looks like, and then focus particularly on the South African Police Service, the Directorate for Priority Investigations, known as the Hawks, and the National Prosecuting Authority, before looking at making that kind of assessment. So, our President recently stated that the scale of state capture was much worse than previously thought, and he mentioned that as much as 500 billion rand of public money was stolen as a result of it. Other analysts have estimated that as much as 1.5 trillion rand has been lost to the South African government if you take into account additional money flows such as lost tax revenue, the negative impact on growth, that the actual impact when it comes to our economy is almost 3 times as large. But how did this occur? In 2013, the Country Review Report of South Africa on the implementation of Chapters 3 and 4 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption paints a relatively positive picture of South Africa. It shows that we have a multitude of organizations that have a dedicated mandate, or a part of their mandate is dedicated to fighting corruption, and sufficient laws in place to deal with asset forfeiture, witness protection, investigations, referrals, disciplinary systems, and that our structures such as the NPA are, at least on paper, independent. Of course, that was a paper exercise on what is in place in relation to the requirements of that convention. However, we now know that it doesn't matter what is on paper, it matters actually who is leading these institutions and their dedication to tackling corruption. So the National Development Plan back in 2012 recognizes that South Africa has a multi-agency system. It does consider the argument that can lead to a multiplicity of duplications, different organizations stepping on each other's toes or getting into conflict, and recognizes that the single agency system, such as the Independent Commission Against Corruption in Hong Kong, has a strong argument for it. That you have one single agency that you know is fighting corruption, and there is very clear about how much capacity it has and what it's doing. However, it does argue against that in saying that then you only have to capture one agency. But if you have lots of agencies who have some capacity, then you have a better chance of making some headway. Even if some agencies are captured, others are still able to make some headway. And so it strongly argues for a multi-agency, which we have today. And in fact, if you go through it, in one of our future or soon-to-release papers, we'll just look at this system in a bit more detail. There are around 20 agencies or departments or structures that have a role to play in preventing, monitoring, or reducing or investigating corruption. You get those that are criminal justice agencies that are dedicated to investigating or surveying potential corruption, and that we obviously speak about the Special Investigation Unit as investigations, the South African Police Service, the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate. The National Prosecuting Authority has both the Asset Forfeiture Unit, the Special Commercial Crimes Unit, and now an Investigating Directorate focusing on high-level corruption. We have the Financial Intelligence Center and the State Security Agencies. So they all have those are the agencies that are probably at the forefront of doing surveillance, tracking corruption, and actually investigating allegations of corruption. In addition to that, we have constitutional and various public oversight bodies that have particular roles as well. And these are your Chapter 9 institutions, such as the Auditor General, Competition Commission, Inspector General of Intelligence, and then we have parliamentary committees, municipal public accounts committees, Public Protector, the Public Service Commission. In addition to that, we have dedicated coordinating mechanisms such as the Anti-Corruption Interministerial Committee and the Anti-Corruption Task Team, and a variety of other bodies. So it really looks good on paper, and it's quite astonishing that so much money was able to be stolen, given how many agencies are either directly investigating or trying to stop corruption. And then along comes state capture. How could the system be so fundamentally undermined? Only from the top. It has to take the highest office in the land, enabled by very powerful people, to ensure that as many of these systems can be undermined as possible. I won't get into all the detail around that. Our submission with Corruption Watch to the Zondo Commission just focuses on pretty much the criminal justice agencies, the police, the Hawks and the NPA, and components of the police like crime intelligence. What happened there is a case study of how very early on, before even becoming president, those supporting Jacob Zuma managed to shut down the Scorpions, our elite anti-corruption investigating unit, and then started to deploy people specifically to support what later became known as the State Capture Project. And this caused massive destabilization in many agencies. So for example, we've had many heads of the South African Police Service. We had 6 sitting in that post in a period of about 10 years, and a similar number of people in the NPA. That generally causes massive destabilization, and many of those people were then making other appointments further down the chain. So the impact of state capture has been really devastating for the criminal justice system, and the consequences have been as devastating. So today we face a far greater public safety challenge than we were facing in 2012, when pretty much the afterglow of the World Cup ended, and the impact of the state capture project started really ramping up, and the criminal justice system was on its in the early stages of deterioration. And for the last 7 years, we've seen huge increases in murder, 35% increase in murder, which is almost 5,000 more murders in the most recent crime statistics than was 7 years ago. And we see 140,000 additional armed attacks, aggravated robberies being reported to the police than was reported 7 years ago. Those are just 2 indicators of how everybody in South Africa is far more at risk, and how state capture not only cost us in monetary terms, but has led to increase in people losing their lives and feeling unsafe in their houses. And now we're at the very bottom of, we're now at a situation where the agencies that were damaged during state capture have to start improving themselves. And the damage is extensive. We know from the Hawks that they've lost thousands of investigators. They need around 2,500 more investigators to be able to adequately deal with the caseload that they're facing at the moment. There are about 1,700 investigators currently dealing with around 19,000 cases. And that is before a lot of these new cases that we'll see coming out of the Zondo Commission start emerging. We know from the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority, that there are 26% understaffed. Again, 1,147 vacancies of prosecutors that are needed in the courts to make sure that the cases that they receive are prosecuted. In the last 2 years alone, we've seen a 10% decline in the number of cases they receive because the police detective capacity has been so badly diminished. And they are also, there was a 14% drop in the number of cases they were able to finalize in court with a verdict because of this massive skill shortfall. So that is where we are at the moment. And the South African Police Service has virtually every indicator from 2012 onwards declined, whether it's intelligence products, whether it was detection rates for various crimes, the ability of the detectives to solve crimes, roadblocks, the visible policing aspects, all of that has been declining. So that is where we are, but now we have reasons for hope. With the police the decline seems to have stopped. In the most recent annual report, we've seen these deteriorations largely stabilize, which is a good thing. I think the challenges there still remain that there's no dedicated strategy for improving the South African Police Service efficiencies and ability to function. The National Development Plan clearly recognizes the serial crisis of top management as being fundamental to police reform. So when you've had 6 different national commissioners and they've been appointing different people, and those people have been appointing different people, you have a situation where we have at the moment around 200 top generals, many of whom should not be there. They were not regularly appointed. They were not appointed because of their ability to fulfill the functions of the post that they hold. And if they are in those positions, they're not necessarily trusted by the many excellent men and women who are generals, who are doing the jobs they should be doing. So your entire leadership cohort can't make sure that the organization has a clear strategy, and that the systems for training, recruiting, resourcing, and holding police officers accountable to clear standards have largely broken down, because that top cohort of 200 people are not working in a clear strategic way to reform the systems. And as to date, unfortunately, we don't see any efforts to implement the National Development Plan recommendations, to do a detailed performance assessment on those 200 generals, to make sure that those that shouldn't be there are redeployed or removed, and that those that should be there are recognized for their contribution, and where posts are opened up, they are filled through a competitive, merit-based, transparent approach. And only after we have those 200 generals being the best possible men and women they can be in the South African Police Service will we start seeing really serious improvements in policing, which could make a big difference in 5 years. The news is much more rosier for the other agencies, though. For the Hawks, we do see General Lebier, who's appointed about 18 months ago, doing a very detailed strategic and structural assessment of the NPA, of the Hawks, sorry. He's managed to identify who was appointed regularly, if they were appointed regularly, why a panel, or basically he's doing a very detailed assessment of how people are appointed where, because his predecessor, Bernie Ntlumeza, who was eventually removed for basically lying under oath repeatedly and found not to be fit and proper, replaced about 60% of the Hawks managers while he was there in the short time that he was there. 8 of the 9 provincial heads were appointed by Bernie Ntlumeza. And so he's still stuck with some of those people. Some of those people are being suspended, some are moved out. But he's also looking at the overall structure and how to better deal with cases, and we should start seeing some improvements there. Same with the National Prosecuting Authority. We've got a new head, a new national director who was appointed in January this year, or February this year, and who is tasked with turning the NPA around to try and make sure that the decline that we've seen in the NPA is changing. And she's now been supported with the independent directorate to provide additional investigative capacity to tackling state capture corruption cases. Of course, there are still challenges there. You've got the Hawks and you've got the ID, and how do both these agencies work together rather than in competition? And so there's going to be a lot of focus and work and that needs to be done on that. But coming to the end of my presentation, so we get into discussions and questions, we would say from our perspective, the system should start improving. Of course, when we start seeing more than 210 public servants being convicted for corruption and more than 17 private people being convicted for corruption in a year, that's the key indicator whether the system is actually identifying and successfully prosecuting people. If we see more public servants being dismissed or disciplined for being involved in financial irregularities, that will be a good indicator. So we'll only be able to answer this question, is it improving, when we see those kinds of improvements? But to get there, we believe that there, for example, is there needs to be ongoing strengthening of the TIRE system. That was mentioned a bit by David. We need to make sure that all the different components are working more closely together, that they're sharing more information, and there's certainly indications that that's happening through the anti-corruption task team and other places. Secondly, we definitely need better data, and that was also mentioned by David. If different agencies are reporting bits and pieces of different information without being clear about what that is, we really have absolutely no idea except for very broad indicators like the NPA convicted 210 people in a year. That doesn't really tell us who those people are. They're certainly not cabinet ministers, boards, or executive members of state-owned enterprises, premiers, MECs, top leaders of political parties. Otherwise, we know about that, but it will be in the media. So those 210 people, we can be relatively sure are quite low-level people, not the architects of high-level corruption in South Africa. We need to see legislative amendments to make sure that while the president has the constitutional authority to make appointments to the police, the NPA, security agencies, that this is not unconstrained. One of the things that people often don't know about, although they increasingly do now know, is that it's more difficult to become a constable in the South African police service than it is to become the National Commissioner. A constable has to meet 18 different criteria before they're allowed to be recruited, whereas the National Commissioner can become a National Commissioner if they meet the following criteria. They're a South African-born citizen over the age of 18 and don't possess a criminal record. So you could literally throw a dart at a telephone book and make that person the National Commissioner if the President so wished. And that has been the fundamental problem. The President has exercised, certainly our previous President, his authority to make appointments of people who are not fit for the purpose that they are being appointed for. And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future. Our current President has demonstrated good faith. He has set up a panel to do a round of interviews of people who are nominated, become the National Director of Public Prosecutions. He didn't oppose an application to open this to the public, but that's up to him. If the next president doesn't believe in doing that, there's nothing in place right now by law to ensure that they do that. So we need to see legislative amendments around how these appointments are made. Of course, another big area is our political parties, and there's a paper on our political parties are talking about how terrible corruption is in government. How well do our political parties deal when allegations of corruption are made against their own members? What systems do they have in place? What policies and procedures are in place? And how well or consistently do they implement or take action against their own members? Because that will be an indication of how serious they take corruption when they eventually, or if they are in power. There's a paper that starts exploring that there. But then finally, I'd say that civil society can't rest on its laurels. We had a conference yesterday where the scale of the problem is massive, and it's not something you can just address to the criminal justice system and agencies. We have to see a sea change in attitudes. Of course, civil society has to continue monitoring and playing a role to help provide support and capacity, and make sure people understand what's being done, and to identify areas of shortcomings or make recommendations or advocate or mobilize people into certain directions to try and pressurize government or support government where it needs support. But ultimately, we have a long way to go. 10 years of state capture would take probably the same amount of time to recover from. But I do think that there is good reason to be hopeful so that we won't have to take 10 years, probably a lot less, to start seeing at least the benefits of the current commitment to tackle corruption, and certainly the kind of efforts that Advocate Matibi and his colleagues in government, with support of others, are trying to do. So I'll stop there so we can have the discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Oh, thank you, Gareth. I'm not sure about anyone else in the room, but at some point I felt like I was on a roller coaster ride. We were just going down, 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 and then eventually we could see a light at the end of the tunnel and some really positive achievements coming out of all of this. I mean, especially when one considers that we've got some 20-plus agencies in South Africa that are aimed at tackling corruption, yet still we have things such as state capture happening, which again has socio-economic repercussions for the country. And then we look at how key appointments within the criminal justice system made by politically compromised senior officials are again coming to the fore, emphasizing the need for such appointments to be reviewed and possibly overturned. But with that, I would like you to please join me in once again thanking all our panelists up here for some very interesting and thought-provoking talks. Let's give them a round of applause. I would then also like to thank our online audience for joining us today and bid you all farewell. It is the end of our formal presentations, and now we will be opening the floor for some discussions and questions for everybody in the room. Again, this would be done under Chatham House rules, so feel free to ask any questions, and hopefully you'll get the answers you're looking for. But yes, I'd like to say goodbye to our online audience.